Hi guys and welcome back to Is It Worth It Reviews. Today we are talking about Hiby R6 III. I find this one interesting because it shares some of the similar design solutions with R5 II that I reviewed some time ago, and I quite liked some of its ideas. And its sound also. So I was curious to find out, is R6 that is newer and slightly more expensive actually any better in real life? So starting with the overall looks, build and design, it's quite the same. It's this same sturdy aluminium design with like sharp industrially looking edges and physical controls for most important things. So for example, you have on and off button and display on and off here, and then three smaller buttons for pause and play, next track and previous track. Volume button this time, instead of being on the other side done with two buttons, it's actually on top in form of a small volume knob with a nice tactile feeling. So every time you increase the volume, you'll feel and hear a small click. I think that's a nice touch. This left side of the device only hosts SD card input, so micro SD card input, so you can actually expand your memory. But the most busy side of the device is the bottom. Here you can see line outputs, and there are two of those. One is single-ended, 3.5 millimeters. The other one is 4.4 Pentagon balanced output. Also on the other side of the device, there are headphone outputs. Once again, 3.5 millimeters one and 4.4 balanced one. And in the middle, in the center, you can see USB-C connection, which is multi-purpose actually. Very common functions that most of us will probably be using it for is to charge the device and connect it to your PC to transfer files. But it can also be used as a USB digital input, so you can hook this to your PC and your PC will recognize this as the external DEC. So yeah, it can use your PC as a digital transport and just act as a DEC, like any other standalone DEC. But it can also be configured to be a digital output, so you can connect an external DEC to this DEP, which will then serve as a digital transport only. In that case, you're bypassing its internal DEC, but using the external one, if you wish to do that. Mentioning DEC, there is a Sabre DEC chip inside, and the headphone amplifier is of a really decent power. I'll put that on the screen, and I actually think that power is slightly lower than in R5 II, but it's still enough for most headphones that are not super demanding, and especially in-ears that are quite sensitive by nature, most of them at least. Then the display is of an IPS type, I believe, and it's very readable, it's quite big. The only thing that I've noticed is that inside and on a cloudy day is bright enough. But if you go outside on a sunny day and there is a direct sunlight shining on it, it's not all that bright. You'll have to put some sort of shade above it to clearly see what's happening on the screen. Some other things worth mentioning in the audio settings are selection of digital filters. Those are quite common for Sabre chips, and I'll not go through digital filters. Try for yourself if you can hear any difference and which one you actually prefer. There's also gain selection between low, middle and high. I used it like 99% in the middle gain setting because low was just too low for most of my headphones, including in-ears, and I never actually really needed high, so middle is what I used. But probably most interesting setting here is choosing your amplifier operation mode between Class A and Class AB. That's the same as we had with R5 II. Meaning that if you know how these class operate, you'll know that Class AB is more efficient. It will give you more playback time, but at a supposedly slightly lower sound fidelity. Class A offers a slightly better sound fidelity, but consumes like twice the power from my rough estimate. And I can confirm that Class A actually sounds a little bit better. It's just a touch richer with a richer tone timbre and slightly airier atmosphere and richer inner tone texture. The difference is not big. I can quite enjoy this DAP in Class AB mode, but if you can, I suggest you use Class A. And that if you can means like how do you usually use it? For example, when I go outside, I usually listen to the music for like 1 hour or something like that. And I can basically listen to this one for several days before needing to recharge it. But if you're on a long flight or just any sort of long trip where you know that you'll be stuck with your DAP for maybe 10-20 hours without the opportunity to recharge it, then I suggest you fall to Class AB because it will extend playtime considerably. I do not remember the exact numbers, I'll put them on the screen. Also, using balanced output consumes just a little bit more power than single-ended one, but that's not as drastical as with Class A and Class AB. So balanced mode will shorten the playtime by couple hours, I think maybe 2 or 3 hours, whereas the Class A will just cut it in half compared to Class AB. So the worst case scenario, consumption-wise, is using Class A and balanced output. That is also the best sounding case. Then the best possible case for power consumption is using Class AB and single-ended output, which is the most modest sound fidelity-wise, but you'll get quite a bit of battery lifetime. But on shorter trips and shorter outings, I feel that Class A and balanced output are well worth it. These two combined really lift performance of this unit to a really high level. That said, let's talk sound. Hiby R6 III is clearly a high-resolution device. It can retrieve lots of details and everything is tightly controlled. Tones are well separated. There is empty space around them. Each of musicians and vocals too, they have their own spaces and they're well separated. Background is also dark, and as I mentioned, there's quite a decent amount of air and space around these. So sound staging is generally quite good. Soundstage is wide and it's also deep. It's not one of these very cluttered in your head sounds, but if your headphones or earphones are capable, this DAP actually develops quite a big soundstage, spacious soundstage. The only thing that I've noticed is that the overall tonality of this DAP is on a neutral to slightly leaner side of things. And when I say that, I don't mean that bass line is lean and lacking. Bass line is deep, it has decent kick and punch and energy. It's also really well controlled, it's not warm or anything, it's just a really good, deep, well controlled bass line. Quick, nimble, it starts and stops on a dime. But that leanness that I'm talking about kicks in somewhere in the lower mid-range, where everything is very clean and neat, but I feel that this DAP maybe lacks a little bit of natural body and warmth of tone. Admittedly, that's much more noticeable with in-ears that are tuned that way basically always with slightly depleted lower mid-range, and it's much less noticeable with something like VRM 1, great headphones that have full and lush tonality, and when I hooked them to R6 III, I thought, wow, everything sounds positively clean and controlled and just decluttered. But with most in-ears, I felt a need to slightly adjust tonality, which is actually not a problem because Hiby has great EQ settings, but even more than that, it has something called MSEB, which is a DSP processing of a sound. And you can make it sound a little bit warmer, a little bit richer. You can do a lot of things using both of these, and altering tonality is really not a problem. For me, it's much more important that these building blocks of sound fidelity, like separation, dynamics, control, sound staging, are good, because those are the things that if they're lacking, they cannot be corrected through any sort of EQ. DSP can add a little bit of sensation of bigger soundstage and some effects, but not nearly as much as simply hardware being good and spacious sounding and separating well and having that deep dark background, which R6 has. It has all of these qualities. I just liked tuning its mid-range to be slightly fuller and richer than it is by default. And that actually leads me to few comparisons. First one that I made is with Hiby R5, that's slightly older and slightly cheaper model. And I started by listening to a female vocal and a guitar. And I thought, wow, this is weird. R5 actually sounds a little bit better to my ears by sounding slightly fuller and more natural. But as soon as I've started listening to more songs and more music genres and simply songs with more instruments and bigger sound stages, I've realized that I would have made a mistake judging by that first song only, because R6 III definitely has better microdynamics, its bass line is controlled better, and tones with R6 are separated better. There's like sensation of more empty room between them, and the sound stage is both wider and deeper. R5, in a direct comparison, simply sounded a little bit muddier with fine details and just somewhat more congested, more in your head than around your head. R5 itself sounds really great. When you listen to it on its own, it's very resolving and quick, speedy sounding DAP, but in a direct comparison, R6 is doing that even better with even greater speed and control, and as I said, separation and sound staging. So yes, between these two, I do actually think that R6 III is a better sounding one. Even though R5 is great on its own, in a direct comparison, you'll notice that R6 III is more capable sounding DAP. Then I moved to comparing this DAP to something like external sounding DACs only. And for example, if you compared this DAP to a combination of smartphone and something like DragonFly Cobalt, like a standalone external DAC, R6 III sounds noticeably cleaner, better, punchier and more dynamic than smartphone and DragonFly Cobalt. It sounds like that even compared to Shanling UA5, which is better sounding DAC to DragonFly Cobalt. I just included Cobalt here because it is a well-known reference in the world, but Shanling UA5, being a slightly better DAC, in my opinion, is still not as good in a combination with a smartphone as this DAP on its own. And what I actually needed to surpass R6 III is to connect a Chord Mojo 2 to my smartphone, and only that combination was actually richer sounding, with just fuller, richer tonality and more inner tone texture and like more revealing transients. But that said, Chord Mojo is more expensive than the whole R6 III DAP. And then you have to pair it with your smartphone, and then it's a quite bulky thing to wear around in your pockets, in my opinion. So yeah, it is a win for smartphone Chord Mojo 2 combo, but it comes at a few costs. One of them is just practicality, like the bulkiness of that combo. The other one is price, that's only for this deck is higher than the whole DAP itself. So with that, I can only conclude that R6 III is a pretty great entry into a DAP market. Now, admittedly, I'm not much of a DAP, expensive DAPs guy myself, but I can say that from these DAPs that I personally heard around the same price, I really like what I'm hearing from Hiby R6 III. And it takes a more expensive DAC and less practical combination of the external DAC and smartphone. It took that to actually defeat what R6 III can do sound-wise. So that would be it for today, guys. Now, you know the drill. If you like the video, then click that button, leave a comment, subscribe, consider becoming a patron, that really helps too, and see you next time. Bye.